Hello, my friends. While much of the world is still arguing over what the United States has set in motion in Venezuela, the real headline, quietly emerging, but potentially far more dangerous, is that we may be drifting toward a direct superpower confrontation of the kind we have not seen since the Cold War. I say that because the United States is still chasing an oil tanker formerly known as the Pella 1. I initially thought it was the Pella 2, but the reporting points to Pella 1. The most interesting detail is that the ship is reportedly empty. It carries no oil at the moment. The allegation is that it was involved in Venezuelan oil trade, and it was sanctioned by the United States. Then, in what can only be described as a murky, hurried maneuver, the vessel transferred onto the Russian merchant register. The crew reportedly painted a Russian flag on the hull, which created confusion for authorities and may have helped it avoid seizure at the moment it otherwise might have been taken. There are also reports this was effectively a fire sale transaction, meaning the original owner offloaded the ship quickly and the Russians acquired it. If that is correct, then this is now Russian property, not merely a vessel flying a flag of convenience. The tanker, now under a new status, and apparently with a changed name, has been steaming toward Murmansk, the Russian Arctic port. The United States has been tracking it closely. The U.S. Coast Guard has been conducting surveillance. I have not yet heard confirmed reports that the U.S. Navy is directly involved, but it would be naive to assume the Navy stays out if Washington decides it wants this ship. And that is where the confrontation begins to take shape. Because the Russians, according to multiple reports circulating this morning in American and British media, not only alternative outlets, but the mainstream press as well, have responded with a show of force. The story being pushed is that a Russian submarine has taken station to protect the tanker from seizure. Now, the difficulty with submarines is obvious. They are not meant to be seen. You cannot verify a submarine visually the way you can verify a surface escort. So, I cannot confirm with my own eyes that these claims are true. But when the reporting is widespread across Western media, it is reasonable to assume something is happening, especially if the leaks are coming from Western security sources themselves. And if we are talking about a Russian submarine operating in the North Atlantic in an active deterrent posture, then the most logical assumption is that this would be a nuclear-powered submarine. Nuclear power does not automatically mean nuclear-armed, but Russia does field submarines that carry nuclear weapons. I am not claiming this particular submarine carries them. I am saying the possibility exists, and the messaging is the point. So ask the obvious question, why deploy something so serious, potentially a nuclear-powered submarine, to guard a single tanker that 2 weeks ago was not even part of Russia's merchant fleet? That question is exactly the point. I do not believe the logic here is simply to protect this particular ship for its own sake. I think Moscow is conveying intent. They are signaling that ships carrying the Russian flag will be protected even when that flag has been acquired in a dubious, hurried, politically charged way. They are drawing a line. If Washington turns ship seizures into a routine instrument of coercion against Russian-linked maritime commerce, then Russia will impose a cost. And I strongly suspect this also connects to a broader pattern that has been building over recent weeks. There have been reports, some frankly brazen, about U.S. intelligence support to Ukrainian operations, including drone attacks. Not merely strikes inside Russia against refineries and infrastructure, but activity aimed at merchant shipping tied to Russian trade, the so-called shadow fleet. Combine that with an expanding practice of vessels transferring to the Russian flag and joining the Russian merchant register, often, undoubtedly, with Russian coordination, and you have a situation where Moscow perceives a campaign, harass, interdict, and intimidate trade routes that keep Russia's war economy and export revenues functioning. If that is the frame Moscow is operating under, then the Pella episode becomes the perfect moment to establish a red line. Not because the Pella is precious, but because the precedent is existential. If you allow the United States to seize ships at will on political grounds, you are allowing Washington to rewrite maritime trade rules by force. Now, I need to be careful here, and I will say this up front. Even if the United States tries to seize the tanker as it moves toward the Barents Sea, potentially transiting past areas near Scotland, I am not convinced the submarine, if it is there, is under standing orders to take immediate action. A submarine is not the ideal platform for convoy duty. It is a war platform designed to stalk, to deter, to strike in the context of major conflict. If you want to escort merchant shipping, you normally use surface ships, corvettes, light frigates, and escort vessels with air defense and anti-surface capability. Russia has such ships, what they call corvettes, though Western navies would often label them light frigates, equipped with missiles, guns, and air defense systems, more suited for deterring Coast Guard or even naval intervention in an escort scenario. The fact that we are hearing submarine rather than surface escort suggests urgency, and improvisation. It suggests there may not have been a Russian surface asset in the right position at the right time, so Moscow reached for what it had on station, possibly a nuclear submarine already deployed as part of Russia's normal North Atlantic posture, and used it as a blunt instrument of deterrence. That itself tells you something. Russia is communicating that it is prepared to go to extremes to defend its maritime trade and national prestige. And it also signals how seriously Moscow is taking the broader trend, US and Ukrainian operations targeting Russian commerce and an expanding effort to choke Russia's trading network at sea. If Washington escalates and makes a move to seize the ship anyway, Moscow will interpret it as a deliberate statement of intent. The United States is willing to risk direct confrontation at sea, and the next Russian reaction will likely be stronger, more visible, and more structured. You could see convoys, you could see surface escorts, you could see a posture that dares the United States to decide whether it truly wants to test Russia ship for ship. And that is where the strategic picture widens, because Russia will not operate in a vacuum. One of the first things Moscow would do is consult with Beijing. China now fields the largest fleet in the world by numbers. The US Navy still leads in overall tonnage and global carrier capability, and Russia currently has no operational aircraft carrier. But that's not the immediate issue. The question is, would the United States be prepared to confront Chinese warships escorting commercial shipping? Would Washington really want to find itself in a situation where a seizure operation turns into a standoff not only with Russia, but with China as well? These confrontations have a habit of slipping out of control. That is the danger. You can begin with a law enforcement narrative and end with a crisis that forces military decisions under pressure and imperfect information. My reading is that the United States, despite aggressive acts, despite the escalation habits of the previous administration, despite years of covert games and proxy warfare, does not truly want direct war with Russia. Not over Ukraine, not over maritime seizures, especially not when Washington is also nervous about provoking a larger confrontation with China in the Indo-Pacific. The global balance is shifting. Russia has expanded its military, gained enormous operational experience, and demonstrated advantages in certain technologies, hypersonics and drones among them. The United States has global commitments and a military that has been stretched, reorganized, and in many respects hollowed out over decades of misdirected wars. It is not the posture of a confident hegemon, it is the posture of a power trying to enforce rules it no longer has the capacity to enforce universally. So, yes, watch the Pella story closely. It may look like a minor maritime episode. It is not. It is a test of intent, a test of credibility, and potentially a test of whether Washington understands the difference between coercion and provocation. Now, let me pivot to Europe, because what happened in Paris over the last 24 to 36 hours fits into the same pattern of Western dysfunction. There was yet another meeting of that grotesque, self-dramatizing coalition of the willing cobbled together by Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer. The Americans attended, though Marco Rubio was expected and did not appear apparently tied up with Venezuela and other priorities. The U.S. presence came through Steve Witkoff, a figure whose formal role remains unclear in public terms, and there were also reports of Jared Kushner being present. Zelensky, of course, was there. And the European leaders performed their usual ritual: enthusiastic greetings, heroic framing, fervid public theater. We were told this meeting would focus on security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of peace. Zelensky has been angling for guarantees resembling NATO's Article 5, meaning, in plain language, a commitment that drags the West into war with Russia if conflict resumes. There was speculation that the United States might finally endorse something along those lines, but it didn't happen. The meeting ran for hours, a statement emerged, but the United States did not sign it. Witkoff spoke in vague generalities, strong guarantees, as strong as any, intent aligned with President Trump, yet no substance, no binding commitments, no details. In other words, words for the cameras, but nothing that locks Washington in. That is telling. It underscores the reality I have been emphasizing. The United States ultimately does not want to be trapped in an all-out confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, a country it has never formally committed to defend, not in 1991, not in 2004, not in 2014, and not even after February 2022. The more the military balance shifts, the less appetite there is in the U.S. system, especially inside the Pentagon, for guarantees that Russia will interpret as NATO membership by another name. And that American reluctance, however dressed up, was a major disappointment for the Europeans. There was commentary suggesting Starmer avoided criticizing the U.S. operation in Venezuela because he didn't want to jeopardize the Paris outcome. If that is accurate, then it was appeasement of the United States. And like most appeasement, it delivered nothing. The Europeans, meanwhile, emerged from Paris as belligerent as ever. Starmer repeats, "as long as it takes," a phrase that has become the hallmark of political irresponsibility. Macron postures. Others follow. Then we get the familiar escalation theater, talk of deploying peacekeepers, then reassurance forces, then ceasefire monitors. The name changes, the intent does not. The intent is to prolong the war and to inject into any negotiation a deal breaker that Russia will reject. Western troops on Ukrainian soil under a Western political mandate. The Europeans know Russia will not accept it. That is precisely why they keep raising it. It sabotages settlement while allowing them to claim leadership and relevance. But here is the brutal reality. European militaries, Britain's, Germany's, and likely France's as well, are in no condition to deploy credible forces for such a mission. Britain's armed forces are in worse condition than they were when the war began. Germany's problems are widely recognized. France may have pockets of capability, but it cannot sustain a serious confrontation with Russia on the scale implied by these fantasies. And even if they could, there is little public support, especially in France, where hostility in the National Assembly is real. So why persist? Because Europe's leadership class is trapped. They cannot change course without admitting catastrophic misjudgment. They cannot negotiate with Russia because their entire post-2022 identity has been built around moralizing confrontation. They cannot sustain Ukraine alone. They cannot generate the industrial base to outproduce Russia. They cannot produce a diplomatic initiative that matters. So they default to sabotage, escalation, rhetoric, and internal repression against dissent. And at the same time, Europe is being squeezed economically. Deindustrialization in Germany is not an abstract concept anymore. Unemployment is rising. Debt is rising. Stress appears in smaller banking institutions that underpin Germany's traditional economic model. Energy insecurity remains unresolved. Gas storage concerns, whether you treat the sourcing skeptically or not, fit the visible pattern. Europe has cut itself off from stable pipeline supply and replaced it with more expensive LNG and volatile spot purchases. That system can function in mild conditions. It becomes brittle under stress, cold winters, hot summers, supply disruptions, price shocks. Meanwhile, the Ukraine war situation has continued to deteriorate for Kiev. After major phases of activity, pauses and consolidation are normal, especially around holidays and under winter conditions. But the strategic arc has not changed. Russia has expanded its forces, learned, adapted, and built a war economy. Ukraine bleeds manpower and infrastructure. Europe bleeds credibility, industry, and cohesion. And perhaps worse for Europe in 2025 was the exposure of its irrelevance. The meaningful dialogue, whatever its limits, has been between Washington and Moscow. Europe can obstruct from the sidelines, but it cannot shape outcomes. It does not have leverage. It does not have a viable plan. It does not even have unity. At the same time, the transatlantic relationship is fraying. The United States is increasingly predatory toward its allies. It pressures Europe economically and strategically. And Europe responds with submission because its leaders have no independent framework left. This is where the Greenland issue becomes emblematic. If Washington moves toward annexation or effective seizure of Greenland, where is Europe's coalition of the willing then? Where is the talk of deploying European forces to defend a NATO and EU members' sovereignty? It does not exist. They will talk about risking war with Russia in Ukraine, where there are no treaty obligations, but they cannot even bring themselves to organize serious resistance to American predation in the Arctic against Denmark. So Europe drifts, economically weaker, strategically incoherent, politically repressive, morally performative, and dependent on an American patron that increasingly behaves like a creditor collecting debts. Now bring it back to the present moment. Russia is sending signals. One is at sea, the Pella episode, the reported submarine posture, the implied red line around maritime trade and flag protection. Another is political, Putin returning to public activity around the Orthodox Christmas period, signaling the leadership is engaged and ready to move in 2026 with a hardened posture. And another is strategic. Moscow may believe recent events, including attacks attributed to Ukraine with varying degrees of Western involvement, justify a more assertive line toward Washington. From Moscow's point of view, its diplomatic position has strengthened. Venezuela, whatever the details, has increased Russia's significance to China and complicated Washington's global maneuvering. Europe is failing and divided. Ukraine is weakening. The West is trapped in contradictions. So I will end where I began. Do not underestimate the importance of what looks like a minor maritime drama. If the United States tries to seize a ship now treated as Russian property under a Russian flag, and Russia chooses to visibly contest that move, we are no longer talking about proxy war dynamics. We are talking about direct confrontation risks, miscalculation risks, crisis escalation risks, and because what we're watching is not a series of disconnected crises. It's a single system under strain, lashing out in different directions, and meeting resistance in places where 5, 10, 15 years ago, it would have expected compliance. Start with the Pella affair. On the surface, it looks like a legal dispute. Sanctions, registration, flags, ownership, shadow fleets. But the deeper issue is far simpler. Who controls the sea lanes, and who decides what trade is allowed? For decades, the United States has treated that question as settled. Washington acts, others adapt. A ship is stopped, inspected, seized, frozen, diverted, then the rest of the world is instructed to call it rules-based order. But the rules were never neutral. They were instruments. And now we're seeing something new. A major power is signaling that the instrument will be resisted openly, aggressively, and with tools designed for war. That is why this is so dangerous. If the reports are correct, Moscow did not choose the perfect tool for escort duty. It chose the tool that carries the clearest message. A submarine, especially a nuclear-powered one, is not there to negotiate. It's there to imply consequences, to alter the calculations of any commander on the other side who might be told to move from surveillance to seizure. It is Moscow saying, in effect, if you want to turn maritime commerce into a battlefield, understand what kind of battlefield you are creating. And if you think Washington doesn't hear that message, you're misunderstanding the psychology of the American system. It hears it. It just doesn't know how to respond without losing face. That's the trap. The U.S. establishment has spent years elevating symbolism, sanctions, seizures, indictments, press conferences into substitutes for strategy. It does these things because they are easy, because they look like action, because they create headlines. But when symbolism meets a hard countersignal, the next step is always escalation because backing down feels like defeat. Now look at Paris. Europe is acting out the same pathology. The coalition of the willing is not a coalition, and it isn't willing. It's a stage production. It's leaders whose domestic legitimacy is collapsing, trying to borrow importance from foreign crises. The choreography is always the same. Zelensky is paraded as a heroic symbol. Commitments are announced in inflated language. The details are left vague, and the bill is sent to the public. But what did Paris actually produce? Nothing binding from the Americans. No signature, no guarantees with weight, just vague words and theatrical reassurance. That's what the Europeans got because that's what they deserve, after spending years behaving like an auxiliary branch of American policy while simultaneously pretending to be strategic actors. And here's the key. Europe's leaders know they cannot win this war. They know they cannot arm Ukraine at the rate Russia can outproduce them. They know their militaries are not prepared for direct confrontation. They know their populations are not eager to spill blood in the Donbass. And they know Russia will never accept Western troops in Ukraine under Western command. So why keep pushing it? Because they are not pursuing victory. They are pursuing delay. Delay is survival for Zelensky's regime, for the careers of certain European leaders, for bureaucratic machines that have staked their entire identity on this conflict. Delay means another summit, another pledge, another package, another emergency vote, another moral performance. And every time they delay, they hope the United States will be trapped, locked in so tightly that it can't change course without humiliating itself. That is what security guarantees are really about, not protecting Ukraine, but handcuffing Washington. And Washington, for all its bluster, refuses. Not because it has suddenly discovered wisdom, but because the Pentagon and the intelligence services understand something very basic. Russia is not Iraq. You don't get to strike and smile and move on. The Russians have depth, endurance, industrial capacity, and a willingness to absorb pain that Western political systems cannot match. And in 2026, the Russians have something else, momentum. Now add Venezuela. That story is still in flux, but the pattern is familiar. The United States treats other countries' resources as if they exist to compensate Washington for its own policy failures. It frames coercion as justice and theft as reparations. It talks openly about managing funds, controlling oil, deciding distribution, things that, in any other context, would be recognized as imperial behavior without the mask. And yet, even there, the American machine doesn't look confident. It looks hurried. It looks improvisational. It looks like a system that believes it must grab what it can while it can because the future feels less controllable than the past. So here we are, January 2026, watching a world where the old reflexes no longer produce the old outcomes. A tanker changes flag and suddenly becomes a potential trigger for a superpower incident. A European summit produces more rhetoric than reality because Europe's power is more performance than substance. An American administration tries to project dominance while quietly avoiding commitments that could bring direct war with Russia. Russia signals that it will defend its trade routes and its prestige with serious assets, even at the risk of escalation. China remains the silent weight in the room, the force that turns any US-Russia confrontation into a much larger strategic problem. And this is why I keep coming back to a simple warning. Crises become wars when leaders mistake theater for strategy. A seizure at sea, a misread sonar contact, a shadowing maneuver that turns into a collision, a commander who thinks he has to act to preserve credibility, a political class that believes retreat is impossible. That is how these things begin. If the United States is wise, it will treat the Pella episode as a boundary test, not a stage for punishment. It will recognize that you do not police a nuclear power into submission. You do not seize your way to stability. You do not sanction your way to strategic victory. And you do not bluff your way out of a confrontation once the other side has decided it will no longer absorb humiliation. If Europe is wise, though there is little evidence of it, it will stop trying to sabotage every path towards settlement, stop feeding illusions about peacekeepers, and stop acting as if slogans can replace industrial capacity and military readiness. Because Europe is not building strength. It is accumulating debt, eroding social cohesion, and drifting deeper into political repression to silence the anger that inevitably follows economic decline. And if Russia is wise, and this is the crucial part, it will calibrate its pushback carefully. Firm, yes. Visible, yes. But controlled. Because once you step into direct confrontation dynamics, you are no longer managing Ukraine. You are managing the possibility of a cascading crisis between nuclear-armed states. That is the difference. So here is the real conclusion, the one people don't want to say out loud. The West has entered 2026 weaker than it admits, more divided than it pretends, and more reliant on escalation narratives than ever before. Russia has entered 2026 more confident, more experienced, and increasingly willing to draw lines. Washington is no longer accustomed to respecting, and somewhere in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, a tanker that may not even be carrying oil has become a symbol of a world where the old habits no longer guarantee the old dominance. That is the danger, because when empires discover their tools no longer work, they don't suddenly become humble. They become impulsive. They become punitive. They become reckless, especially when their leaders are unpopular, their economies are strained, and their legitimacy is cracking. So keep your eye on the sea lanes. Keep your eye on the quiet signals. Keep your eye on what governments do, not what they say. And above all, understand this. If the Pella episode escalates, it won't be about one ship. It will be about whether the era of unilateral American enforcement is ending and what replaces it when the other side finally says, no further, not here, not now, not ever again.